Mention the answer.
Now, I'm not going to get too esoteric with a multinational audience, but we are from roughly the same part of the world, in the West Riding of Yorkshire in England. And for those who don't know, the patch that you're from is called Kirklees. And it's actually a bit of a rich seam of acting talent, isn't it? Because we've got Lena Headey, Cersei from Game of Thrones, grew up in Denby Dale. We have Jodie Whittaker, the new Doctor Who from Skelmanthorpe. We have the legend that's James Mason. We have yourself. So what is it in the water there?
Well, it always amused me that James Mason was from Huddersfield. I always adored him as an actor, but there was nothing of Huddersfield about James Mason. He sounded as though he had grown up in Mayfair, in a very privileged childhood. Well, he was quite privileged because his father was a miller.
He was, yeah.
And there is a statue of James Mason in the front lobby of the theatre, along with a statue of Harold Wilson, our socialist prime minister, outside the railway station, which is a very appropriate place for him to be.
And that was where it began. So was there a kind of what was growing up in that environment like for somebody, you know, looking back, that would end up being in cinema and being on the stage? What were the kind of the first kernels of this interest being stirred in post-war Mirfield?
Well, it was not an environment that encouraged young people to go into the creative world. Not at all. But it was a neighborhood where it was not thought excessive or overly flamboyant or too much self-obsession to be a performer. So amateur theatricals, amateur choirs, amateur painting, amateur music was very, very important. You were not thought odd if you were an entertainer. On the contrary, people really enjoyed that. And but there was nobody in my life who was an example or a role model for me who actually went into the business. By the way, Peter O'Toole also, of course, came from Leeds.
Did come from Leeds, yes.
And of course, the great Brian Blessed. I'm sure some of you will know who Brian Blessed is. He was a childhood friend of mine. I met Brian when I was 12 and he was 14. But every Christmas, for example, in my home, there would come a point on Christmas Day night when the performances would begin, and every person would be invited one after the other to perform something. It might have been a song, or playing the piano, or in my case, always rather pretentiously reciting Shakespeare. But my favorite one I always look forward to every year was my mother's sister, my Auntie Annie, or Auntie Annie as I would have called her then, recited a poem, a dialect poem, Yorkshire dialect. Now the Yorkshire accent is quite tricky for people outsiders to understand. I know, I have an American wife from Nevada, and she struggled with Yorkshire for a long time. But when I was a child, I also spoke a dialect. So it wasn't just a matter of how I pronounced familiar English words, but that we spoke different words. It was not a whole language, but it was pretty rich nevertheless. I'll give you an example, if you like. In fact, I will quote the first few lines of my Auntie Annie's poem. I was sitting there asking like them, now other one fella were you off, because that yard that me old Aunt Susanna were laid up in bed with a cough. Just some brasses me old Aunt Susanna, that's reason she's looked after sore. If they've note, well, they're note but a bother. There's a sample with old Uncle Joe. That was how I spoke. Yeah, well, yes, you need a little bit more coaching.
Yeah.
One tiny example, for instance, of how ancient this dialect was. Well, ancient is perhaps a little exaggerated, But when I would go to a friend's house to ask him if he was coming out to play, whatever, cricket, Cowboys and Indians, whatever, I would say to him, "Atta leken out. Atta, art thou, not you, but thou. Atta, art thou. Leken," which is an old dialect word. I've only quite recently discovered that in the 17th century, actors were called lakers. Atta leken, are you playing out? Out. Are you playing out? And so from the age of about 12 and a half, when I met my first serious acting teacher, a woman who had worked at the London Old Vic for many years, had understudied Peggy Ashcroft in many of her most famous roles, Dame Peggy Ashcroft. She said to me, if you're serious about acting, and we were not talking about professional acting, but amateur acting, you need to be able to speak English with standard pronunciation. And so for about 2.5 years, 3 years, I lived a double life. Monday to Friday, I talked like that, because nobody possibly understood what I was talking about. And Saturdays and Sundays, I talked like this, with a standard English, at least trying to, but occasionally I made mistakes. People didn't mind if I broke into my Yorkshire, but if with my friends,
Right, the reverse.
I did the reverse, I was mocked mercilessly. So it was a little bit challenging.
You mentioned Shakespeare.